All right, hello everybody. Thanks for coming to the AI seminar. So I'm introducing Alexander Titus. So Alexander Titus is a technologist working at the intersection of machine learning, bioinformatics, and software engineering, focused on understanding the paradigms of life in biological systems using modern computing tools and the opportunity and risk trade-offs of the intersection of AI and biology. His work ranges from developing new algorithms to studying fundamental biology, to understanding the functional relationship between biotechnology and new product development. When he's not doing research, he is the founder of Bioeconomy.XYZ, which is a publication focused on making the bioeconomy more accessible to the general public. He's also a former principal director for biotechnology within the office of the CTO at the DoD, where he led the first enterprise biotechnology modernization strategy. Titus, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So I really appreciate everyone inviting me here today and for everyone showing up on this beautiful view kind of day. As I was just saying, I spent some time in the Pentagon, and I was lucky when I had a window that stared at another wall, that I had the most coveted office in the place. So I'm going to talk a little bit from a perspective, from a couple different perspectives today. So as my intro talks about, I've spent time in policy, government, in industry and academia. And really, this is more from a perspective of identifying a gap in the literature that is significantly needed to inform a lot of the policy discussions that are going on today. All of our big AI CEOs were on the Hill this week talking about the future of AI, and AI and bio came up a number of times. And none of these people are AI and bio people, but since they're AI people, people are starting to ask about this. And so
Mark Zuckerberg isn't a biologist.
No, surprisingly not. He's not an expert in biosecurity. But they get to ask these questions anyway. So old habits die hard from a former government person and one of my current government hats. Just so you know, these are my views and not the official views of any of the institutions I represent, except for the ones that I founded. But that's really not a specific government view. So I'm going to give you a little context. I think it's probably, I don't have to do too much argument for why biotech is important, but I'm going to just give you an example of this, of why AI starts to be really important in these spaces. So this was Ed Yong is a great Atlantic journalist, if anyone has ever read any of his work. And this paper was specifically, this piece was specifically about a young woman in the UK who was dying of an incurable infectious disease. They had antibiotic resistance, couldn't cure it. And so they called a professor at the University of Pittsburgh who had been studying phages for his whole career. And phages are viruses that specifically infect bacteria. And so they said, we're looking to deal with this kind of bacteria. This bacteria has this type of phenotype, or the class, the kind of way it presents itself. So can you use the data that you've been collecting over the years to do some data mining and see if we can engineer a phage therapy to deal with this infection? So they did that. They were able to find something that was relevant. They took that piece of genetic material and engineered it into a chassis that was more amenable to being used in drug development, and they could cure this incurable infection. And this is interesting because the piece, unlike microelectronics, where we have invented everything from the ground up, biology, we're still picking up the Lego pieces out of the woods. And in this case, this piece of DNA was identified by a high school student in South Africa on the bottom of a rotting eggplant. And so someone had taken a sample, sequenced it for a high school project, put it into this database. These scientists were able to use that data to engineer therapy that saved a young woman's life from ways that we couldn't do before. And so the power of data across the life sciences is growing more and more as we get better at engineering things. We're also starting to see the very first entirely AI-driven drug development entering clinical trials this year. So this is from start to all the way up to the analysis and assessment through where you start doing your preclinical animal trials and things. These drug candidates were entirely developed, kind of discovered autonomously through AI and other types of machine learning models to identify these candidates. And so we're starting to see this acceleration of drug development at a really massive rate. So we have the kind of heuristic development plus the automated development, which is theoretically going to save a lot of lives. But at the same time, we're starting to see a number of cases that are popping up that are concerning people. And so this is an example of a lab out of a university in Canada where they were able to, for less than $100,000, synthesize the pieces and reconstitute a horsepox. And this horsepox virus is extinct, but it's a close cousin of smallpox, which is also eradicated functionally. And so this caused a lot of stir in the biosecurity community saying, well, what happens if this becomes better and more automated? Anyone could potentially create a bioweapon. And so this caused a lot, but this is the other side of the coin to the groups that are doing really amazing stuff to dig into this. And so this contrast between the opportunities and the risks is becoming really prominent in the public discourse and policy debate right now. And there's not a great focus on the intersection at the moment. So to give you a little bit of background about how I came to this view. So I've been in science, technology, policy, and kind of this intersection for a while. My PhD focused on using some of the early applications of variational autoencoders and unsupervised deep learning models to study latent biology. So how do you turn cancer that is thousands of biomarkers, hundreds of thousands of biomarkers down into a set of latent dimensions where you could actually see if you could understand relationships between tumors that we weren't measuring otherwise. And during that time, those same, I mean, everyone here who does ML and AI knows that these apply to a lot of different areas. And so I worked on a completely orthogonal set of tasks at Alexa, at the Amazon Alexa team, where I was starting to do NLP to figure out how to crowdsource and prevent Alexa from turning on when, for example, Jimmy Fallon on his show said, Alexa, order 100 pool noodles, and then approved all of the different checks and balances. And all of a sudden, a bunch of people were ordering pool noodles that they didn't actually want and had 100 pool noodles show up at their house. So how do you prevent that from happening when you don't have the ability to predict that these things are going to happen?
Did you solve the problem?
Yes. So it's an active body of research, but that specific type of problem is has been functionally solved, but not completely solved, because then there's a whole bunch of edge cases, like when my name Alexander is said with a European accent, it often activates Alexa systems, things like that. So you don't want to prevent people with European accents from using Alexa and prevent them from talking to me in my own home, kind of thing. So there's all of these functional checks and balances that are still in there. So I was actively publishing in this space when I was connected to In-Q-Tel, which is a venture capital firm that also does research on behalf of the national security community. And they were interested in figuring out how to use homomorphic encryption to build secure database query systems so that you wouldn't tell the database what sequence of concern you were looking for, but you could still say, I have a new piece of biology. Does it exist in some threat database, something, without actually exposing that? And this led to me spending some time actually in the national security community, developing some of these tools. And there's some really interesting applications. IARPA, for example, has funded some interesting programs in this space. One called Felix, which is focused on finding the linked indicators of engineering. So how do we take a piece of DNA and use ML and tools like that to predict whether or not someone actually engineered that? And so, for example, in that horsepox example, could we predict this was synthesized rather than a new natural example of horsepox? Because that would then give us a different threat perspective of we actually didn't eradicate smallpox, or we did and someone's trying to bring it back. So that's kind of the conversations that go on there. From this kind of collection of perspectives, I had the fortunate opportunity to be asked to help start the Department of Defense's first kind of enterprise strategy when it comes to biotechnology. Because there's a lot we can do in this space of all new materials, mRNA-based vaccines. Moderna had been receiving DARPA funding for a long time before we all desperately needed it in 2020. And so how do we think about this strategically investing in that while, again, trying to prevent the misuse that people are very concerned about? And so I now currently sit on our National Security Commission for Emerging Biotech. This is specifically why I say I don't represent the commission's view, but all of my thinking is informed by these conversations. And one of the things that I've found is that there's lots of discussion around risks and benefits. There is not, the gap in literature is that there is not a good set of analytical tools and papers out there that talk about the kind of opportunity cost, risk benefit trade-off of doing some of these and specifically developing AI in this space. So I've been advising on policy in this space, and that came to this idea of violet teaming AI in the life sciences. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. But I reached out to a colleague and said, this is a big gap in the literature. I need to figure out who to talk to try to start solving that. I was introduced to Adam, and now get to talk to you today about what's going on here. So take it back a step from a biology standpoint. When we think about why we all have very similar traits or why there's convergent evolution across biology, there's this idea that there is some kind of design paradigm. So what is the ability, what codes for most quadrupeds to have 4 legs, a tail, ears, nose, all roughly similar, or bipeds like us look very similar to chimpanzees, gibbons, all these other species. And that's true across the animal, plant, fungi kingdom. And this is really one of the key questions that the NSF has been trying to ask for a long time. How do we understand these rules of life? And once we understand these rules of life, how do we then manipulate them? And that's really focused on this idea of this genotype to phenotype relationship. So genotype is your genetics. So the A's, T's, C's, and G's that make up your DNA, and phenotype is the traits you have. And so, this picture of the 4 or 5 people at the top, they all have different sets of relationships between their genes and the traits they have. And that's why even when twins can look different, because there's a different set of relationships of their genotype and their phenotype. Manipulating this is actually where modern synthetic biology comes in. And this is where the opportunity and concern starts to happen. So how do you engineer the genetics of an organism, yeast, E. coli, something like that, to produce something that you care about? In the case of, this could be a novel function, or this could be an enhanced or reduced version of a function you want. And so everyone's favorite biotechnology is largely some version of this. For a really long time, we've been using yeast to produce alcohol in some capacity, or fermentation. You could have yogurt, you could have kimchi, you could have beer, wine. Fermentation is the byproduct of alcohol produced through a metabolism of a microorganism. But instead of alcohol, we can now engineer the genotype of those organisms to produce a different product we want, or a different phenotype. So from cell-based therapies to industrial chemicals, we can engineer a lot of this functionality, and we're getting really good at it. And I think I already said this, but this changes in this G2, natural changes to this G2P relationship are what lead to evolution. Over time, you get selected for the variants that have higher fitness for how you move through this. But this is also what leads to disease. So cancer is a disruption to a well-balanced genotype to phenotype relationship. And as soon as that is imbalanced, cells can differentiate in ways that are uncontrolled. They cause different diseases, things like that. And so that's how we end up with, there's been a lot of work in the understanding of this G2P relationship over the years, but it's not a great solved problem. This is some work that I mentioned. I was doing some work in using variational autoencoders to study cancer biology. And so what this is showing is on the vertical axis, those colored lines on the far side, the red, green, blue, black, those are colored by different tumor types. And so what this took is a data set that had 450,000 data points per sample, per tumor, and compressed it, encoded it down to a 100-dimensional latent dimension for this variational autoencoder. And my goal was to figure out if there is actual biology represented in these latent dimensions, because we're doing a massive dimensionality reduction. Is that compressing it into something interesting or losing a lot of information in this? And as you can see from this chart, this cluster chart, there is clearly representative patterns here of learning. This is a 100-dimensional way to represent luminal A breast cancer, for example, or HER2 positive breast cancer. And the chart on the right here is looking of those dimensions, which one of them are enriched for biological features that we care about. So markers in your DNA that either turn on or repress your ability to express the genes that you're working on. But this was very early work in AI applied to biology, and everything has changed dramatically since then, but especially with LLMs, that's changed the conversation across the board. So why is this a hard problem? This is a silly question, but I ask people this all the time, because you and I can all agree we probably know what a cat looks like, right? So this is a cat, and if you disagree, we can debate that. But like, why do we think this is a cat? Because you can't see ears, tails, paw, nothing about this except it's a face gives us the indication that it's a cat, except we have a latent understanding of what a cat looks like, and we have a visual system to be able to interpret this. We can do this auditorily as well. But if you looked at DNA, is this cat DNA? Right, and we don't have a natural way to do this. And despite the fact that it literally says cat, this may or may not be cat DNA, right? So that's maybe a misleading piece of information. But even if we could say, all right, this piece of DNA came from a cat, that genotype to phenotype relationship says, what kind of cat does this come from? Is this fur color? Is this short tail, long hair, short fur, body size related to this cat? How do we understand what that DNA tells us about the animal that it came from? And this is where modern AI is really starting to change the conversation. So I'm sure everyone has heard about AlphaFold. It came out in the last couple of years and profoundly changed people's understanding of what AI can do for biology. And so in this case, the genotype, the genetic sequence of DNA, is predicting the phenotype, the actual three-dimensional structure of proteins for every known protein that we've ever studied. And this has been a problem that the field of protein engineering and X-ray crystallography have been studying for a really long time, because you have to know, to do it experimentally, you have to know exactly how to isolate, how to stabilize, how to be able to extract the protein in a way that's non-destructive. And it takes many, many years. Some people's entire careers are focused on finding the crystal structure of one or two proteins. And AlphaFold predicts these structures for every new protein all at once. And this was a game changer in the field. You know, there's plenty of debate about exactly how good are the predictions, things like that. But the point is, it gives us a hypothesis for everything that significantly changes the pace with which we can do this type of analysis. And we're starting to see more and more of these coming out as we go. So early in January of this year, a company published a paper on an automated scientist to actually design microbial strains that produce new chemicals. So I talked about engineering, synthetic biology, engineering that phenotype to, instead of producing alcohol, produce something else. Well, can you automate the actual physical engineering of these cells to produce any number of these chemical structures that are here from the same set of cells, from your same kind of set of starting conditions? And the reason this is possible is because these AI models are starting to understand the complex relationship of the underlying genetic makeup that we haven't had the ability to measure. We don't have enough resources to measure the complexity of biology yet, but these models are starting to really make that possible. And this is just a bit of the workflow diagram from that paper, but you see it's focused on analyzing the phenotype, figuring out, putting it together with all the data they're using, generating, so it's a generative model of that genotype, and to figure out how we test that sequence, and then see if that actually produces the product that you care about. So back to this example though, this didn't have anything to do with AI up front. This had to do with good synthetic biologists doing this in a lab. But imagine if you start to automate this at scale. And so the argument when they first did this was there's not very many people who can do this, right? This takes really serious expertise when it comes to a synthetic biology standpoint. But there is now starting to be a set of papers that say LLMs are making it much easier to do this, because you can ask the LLM, how would I synthesize something with this kind of functionality? How would I, if I wanted to design this gene, how do I design the pieces so that I could send them to DNA sequencing companies or synthesis companies and get back the pieces I can put together? A lot of synthesis companies screen against that, but the question here is, can you ask, how do I break it up in a point where I can get around screening methodologies? this paper specifically called out, we need promising pre-release evaluations of these types of models. And that's actually getting at the heart of what I will be talking about more is how do we not just pre-release evaluation, but build into the training paradigm our ability to understand the risks here. But because there is lots of people writing papers like this right now and doing this kind of analysis, and there is not yet an abundance of these evaluations, we're starting to see dramatic claims come out in the media and the policy claim. And so this was a paper, journal publication, not a scientific publication, but a policy paper that said in June, a group of students from MIT and Harvard with no scientific background showed they could design a deadly new pandemic outbreak in an hour. That's not actually what they did. They suggested that access to knowledge is easier to do because of this. But when people read that, this is the types of conclusions they're making. And so because these evaluations don't exist, but the paper's saying the risks do, we get a lot of this kind of response. This is problematic because people are then saying, well, how do we prevent this? We need to make sure that this never happens. And so this was an interesting report that came out in the last couple months about how do we think about biosecurity in the age of AI. And I would actually say recommendation 3 there, appropriately guardrailing AI and LLMs, is really where we're not at right now and is what the crux of what we need to be doing. And we're seeing legislation come out that's talking about, all right, we need to assess the risks of AI and biosecurity upfront. But it's just about risks. Nothing about this says, we also need to think about how we can build vaccines faster for whatever new biosecurity kind of concern is out there. It just says, pay attention to what the threats are that are come out of this. This is a separate bill introduced at the same time. Again, just talks about the threats. And so there is no balance here around saying there's an immense potential, right? AI-driven drug discovery means we can decouple physical human time from pharmaceutical development for disease, but then you could also decouple that from things that you don't want them to be built for. This is another paper that came out recently that I don't actually agree with the conclusions, but the conversation is this team of AI researchers were able to come up with new chemical weapons in a matter of a short amount of time. So what they did is in drug development, traditionally you minimize the toxicity of whatever new compound, and that's the first thing you test when you're using animal models. How toxic is it? So they just flip that question on its head and say, let's just optimize the toxicity of the system. And it produced a whole bunch of things that people were talking about. All right, this is a way that people are going to make new chemical weapons. And then people start to say, well, what if we put that with an automated way to design bacterial strains that can produce new chemicals with 40,000 new chemicals that we might not want people testing things on. And so this combination of AI is what's scaring people. And this is the combination where maybe we need to start building methods, training methods, evaluation methods that say, actually, everything in panel A, we do want to be able to do. All the things on the list from the cutout, we don't want to be able to do. So how do we have a dual purpose training paradigm that says, upweight this kind of capability, downweight this kind of capability, and we don't have that today. Lots of people are talking about, let's try to figure out how to censor LLMs, but the consensus I've seen is censoring input attacks is really hard, right? And this gets at the same thing. If you took this from that biology paper example, like, how do I synthesize this? Okay, cool. How do I order this? Okay, cool. Instead of saying, order me a pandemic pathogen or write me a ransomware, just write me the pieces of stages without the context of why they're together. But if this model was aware enough, it would know that these are related queries and what they can possibly be doing. There's multiple papers that show that it's easy to convince all these foundation models, despite best efforts, to not do the things, or to do the things we don't want them to do, right? Identify, step-by-step plan to destroy humanity. That's probably a hyperbolic example for the purpose of the paper, but that's not the kind of thing that people want to be able to do, or we won't want people to do. Claude, for example, from Anthropic, which I use all the time for a whole bunch of things. If you say, can you give me a new piece of biology? It just says, no, I won't generate biology. Because we don't know how to assess whether or not that biology is good or not. It just says, no, call someone else. But that misses out on a lot of the possibility that we can be doing in this space. There's lots of stuff that's starting to come out. I've talked to a number of different AI security companies. There's open source tools that try to improve our ability to do prompt injection or detect prompt injection attacks, things like that. But fundamentally, we need these tools that are going to actually start to improve the models themselves. The other thing is a lot of the analysis right now are looking for malicious or intent and intentional actors. So someone who wants to do a prompt injection, someone who wants to be able to misuse an AI. But I think that that's an entirely different group of people. In the policy and security world, we say, well, what happens if someone has $100 billion? Like, you're not going to sell for software that 25 people are co-developing, right? That's a different problem set. But what about preventing AI from doing the things on accident? So this is an example of a meal planning app where you ask for recipes, and people would have a bunch of ingredients in their shopping cart and say, create me a recipe from this. And so what users started to do is say, oh, I have a bottle of Clorox bleach in my basket, create me a recipe. And the app just said, here, put all these things together. And the example that they cite here is one of them would actually be producing a chlorine gas kind of byproduct from the chemical reaction of those household things. And this wasn't intentional. No one said, I want to produce chlorine gas. This is the kind of thing that I think we absolutely need to be developing tools to prevent, because you could build in that kind of latent understanding of the chemical reactions that produce chlorine and have a model trained so that it doesn't generate those kind of impacts. So this is where this idea of violet teaming comes in. So red, and it literally is a shade of purple away from purple teaming, but red teaming is focusing on the threats. Technologically, how do we figure out how to attack a piece of technology? Blue teaming talks about the opportunities to stop those. Like, how do we plug the holes that might be misused against us? And then violet teaming, or purple. Drum roll.
It's all
Verbal ...
Man, talk about any idea? All right. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Maybe have ourselves a snack.
Did it disconnect?
No,
Such a
I
tease.
didn't touch it.
You're such a tease. That's amazing.
Oh, there we go. All right, we'll see.
Okay. Therefore, the cure for cancer is, I gotta go.
Someone every time his speaker goes out on his remote work, he goes, and that's the meaning of life.
Yeah.
So blue teaming focuses on how do we plug those security gaps, and then purple teaming puts people together kind of in like an adversarial training paradigm where you identify a gap, you solve it, you identify a gap, you solve it. But this is purely from a technical standpoint. And for example, if you wanted to say, make sure I never generate a biology sequence of concern, you do what Anthropic did and say, never generate a biology sequence of concern. Which technologically, they solved that one specific red team concern. But that doesn't take into account then the balance of what are all the things we're missing out on because we refuse to do anything in that space. And this is not a knock on Anthropic. This is, Claude is my favorite. LLM I use a lot, but then they get this paradigm of violet teaming, which was introduced in a Wired article in March, where you actually take that kind of concept, but you build in some of the considerations for impact on institutional and public good. So from a public good standpoint, never using AI to do anything with biology, for example, means you miss out on drug development that could save lives, especially people who have rare diseases where there's just not enough funding to be able to develop some of those. And so this Aviva Avadia wrote this interesting Wired article about his work with ChatGPT. And how do you think about that kind of impact? And so really, we need this paradigm of how do we assess AI and opportunity cost trade-off. We don't have a good way to do this. We have a lot of technology specific focuses that plug gaps, that come up with security patches, things like that, but not this kind of balance. We also, from an economic analytical standpoint, don't have a good assessment of the trade-offs and opportunity costs. And so that leaves us guessing. And especially from a policy standpoint, how do you guess how, if one policy has unintended repercussions down the road? And then this goes, how do we bring that into the public dialogue about policy, about opportunity costs in a way that informs those conversations rather than relies on kind of a recursive hyperbole in the environment. And I think most importantly is this is not a concentration of skill sets and technologies that are in most training programs. I mean, security, cybersecurity, AI security, biosecurity, drug development, or any other topic you're talking about, AI to manage public infrastructure, for example. How do you know the trade-off? If you want to manage a rolling blackout in LA with AI, how do you actually take into account which communities can't go blacked out because of the resources they have access to, versus I'm pretty sure all these people who live out here could go hang out on their yachts and deal with a rolling blackout much more comfortably than someone that needs their air conditioning, for example. So I'm gonna give you two examples of what I mean kind of in practice of how I would go about this. So DNA synthesis I described, when people order something from a company, those companies will take that order and screen that against a database of things that are known to cause concern. This is a voluntary practice, so not everyone does it. But even the companies that do it, they'll take it, they'll screen, they'll give back an answer, yes or no, I can do this, and then they will actually synthesize that. So now we're starting to invent a whole bunch of new biology with generative tools. AlphaFold is changing how we're thinking about biology to get new functionality. There's a whole bunch of interesting generative biology models that are producing sequences of new functionality. And we start to talk about, there are examples of how to get around these sequencing, even when sequencing screening is happening. How do we get around those so I can order all the different parts so that they never gets caught? And so there's no context of what I'm trying to build overall. But what if we started to take these, and again, I'm talking about models that have been open sourced. There's lots of biotech companies that are trying to contribute back to the Hugging Face model ecosystem, or Google's model garden, or any of the other model gardens. How do you then, what if you had a training paradigm where you had a dual purpose loss function that says, we understand the genotype to phenotype relationship of transmissibility. And so we're going to downweight any signatures of increased transmissibility. So we can say, no, you're not going to optimize to make coronavirus even more spreadable or weaponize Ebola or whatever. No, if it's increasing this feature, we're going to downweight that from a generative capacity. But what about its ability to bind, for example, to the coronavirus spike protein that so many vaccines were focused on binding to? Let's upweight that functionality while decreasing anything that might actually cause increased problems. And so this kind of dual function loss training takes context, representative scientific context, into account to be able to do this kind of stuff. But these methods don't exist right now. There are, to my knowledge, and of course, there's always research going on that is unpublished yet, but I don't know of any good examples of this kind of methodology where I could point to and say, actually, what this concern is not as concerning because we have tools to maximize the utility while minimizing that kind of risk. And so what if you had digital screening at the generative side, even before you go into the DNA synthesis screening process? And so you have extra checks and balances along the way that are trying to make sure that not just anyone with a computer could create something scary. Because that's one of the things people are worried about. Any high schooler in their basement now could create a bioweapon. It's like, well, that's not true anyway, just practically. But also we could eliminate people from even having the idea of what some new biology, scary biology would be. Another example that was interesting is there was a paper that showed that entirely from medical imaging, they developed an AI model that could predict, that could classify self-reported race highly accurately, where clinicians didn't think this was possible until they did and built a model to do this. Entirely from multiple modalities across a variety of different degraded applications. And the authors, even in their abstract, say this creates enormous risk for all model deployments in medical imaging. Which my conclusion from reading this is, I actually now know I can model for it. And so I could build this into a secondary priority of loss function and control for confounding variables. So we could have more equitable application of AI across
I think we lost the connection to Marina Del Rey, so stand by. Okay, well, I see Pete trying to do something, so maybe we'll get connected again.
I'm on site
Yeah.
at MDR and it went down here.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
We can see you now.
Mabel, can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you as well.
Click share content.
So how do I just unplug?
No. That's me. All set.
All right, cool. Where was I? So for everyone who was on, we just, while we were getting back up, we were discussing like, well, we don't actually know why this is causing this discrepancy. And that's very true. But the idea is we can make sure that we do everything we can to prevent bias in our models, even before we know why there's bias in their models. Is the idea for all of this kind of violet teaming concept. So I mentioned that bringing together teams is going to be critical here. This is an interesting op-ed that was written a little while ago around how we regulate AI in biology by kind of thinking about them differently in different contexts. But just this, someone also said, combinations of expert teams is going to be more important, especially in the early time, because there's just not a lot of people thinking about it in this context, and not a lot of training programs designed to think about it in this context as well. So just to wrap up, AI in biology is creating some dramatic improvements. AI in a whole bunch of things. AlphaFold was one example of many, and has been applied from things like new vaccines to engineering organisms to degrade plastic for environmental remediation. A different AI model was used to read neural signals and recreate the audio of birdsong. That was really highly accurate audio of a birdsong directly from neural signals. So this has big implications for brain-computer interfaces. And Marlon and I actually met 10 years ago when I was interviewing for grad school, thinking about brain-computer interfaces. I didn't go that route, but we'll bring it full circle. And these types of violet teaming, thinking about this and bringing this context and this consideration, applies to AI across a whole bunch of different modalities. You have NLP, imaging, biology, audio. Right? This is not just the DNA sequences that I spend a lot of time thinking about, but like I said, using AI to manage rolling blackouts in LA is another example. There's a whole bunch that you could apply this kind of context to. And my bigger point is that right now, when I look to the literature for these kind of resources, they don't exist, which is why I think that we really need to be building that out. And so I think that just my takeaway is an AI future defined by balance. Everyone's talking about AI futures. Are we gonna have general intelligence? Are we gonna have the end of days? Are we gonna all lay on the beach in Marina Del Rey for the rest of our time? My hotel has a great beach, so I appreciate the hotel. But yeah, so that's the takeaway. I'd love any questions or thoughts or feedback. Cross that.
Yeah, so thanks for the talk. And I'm curious a lot. You said it at the end, like you think a lot about like sequences with respect to like DNA sequences. But when you were given the example of the ransomware, do you think like the violet teaming is going to be centered around like identifying like sequences of, you know, instructions and potentially like policing or trying to manipulate whether or not certain sequences will be allowed in the future? Because I'm just trying to think through the concept of these are like hugely powerful open tools that can do a lot of different tasks. How can you constrain one type of task while, you know, maximizing benefit? So we'd just love to hear more about how you're thinking of like capturing the sequences or learning from sequences of instructions.
Yeah, I think that it's all about context. So a genome in a biology context, it's a set of strings and it's a really long set of strings. So it's almost like just a giant document. We just have 4 letters instead of 26 letters. And that it's all about the contextual relevance of in what this narration, if you could call it that, signifies with intent, if you will. And so I don't have a great technical answer for you, but the way I think about it is that, you know, transmissibility from a biology standpoint, there's a narrative, if you want to personify the genome, of how this plays out in the physical world. And in the context of the ransomware, that narrative is also tied together, and understanding how that narrative unfolds and the intent of those together, because it's been trained in a way to understand that kind of context of this specific. And I think it's going to, for a long time, it's going to take figuring out how to train for specific tasks so we can figure out the tools and techniques to do this. I don't think embedding just pure North American ethical standards into AI is a loss function that anyone knows how to build right now. But from a cyber attack or a biological concern or a bias in some capacity, I think that those are specific tasks that context really matters in how we think about the problem.
Exactly, like, so basically benefits, so I like, this seems like a simple enough equation, maximize benefit, minimize risks, but who's going to be defining those benefits and risks? Right? That's the first problem. Yeah. Secondly, context matters, but I don't see anything there about context. How do you, like, what is something that there's a risk in one setting, it could be benefit to somebody else in a certain setting. So besides what?
That's spot on. So I had a really interesting conversation with Marjorie recently where I shared a different paper that showed that they estimated that at least a third of all medical treatment recommendations coming out of LLMs don't align to current medical treatment standards. So as a patient looking for information on how I should treat my cancer, 30% of the information I get is not going to be correct. So you could argue that that is not good. But our discussion was centered around, well, what about the people who don't have access to clinical providers? Isn't 66% correct information better than having no one to ask anything to? And so to your point, it very much matters. And so we actually talked about, instead of the term benefit, we think about utility, and utility is still relative to the user, because utility in North Korea has a different context than utility in LA, for example. But that's going to be relative, but it's still problem set by problem set that we don't have techniques to even do it relative to one thing right now.
Let me ask a little bit about where the sort of community practice, in your mind, where does that enter into violet teaming? So that, for example, the naive view is I don't want to create things that are more toxic. But if I'm actually in cancer treatment and I work with chemotherapy, that may not be true, right? I actually want things that are even more selectively toxic.
Right.
How as a community practice with our norms that work in the space, how are we included in violet teaming, if at all?
And who's the we in this context?
The people who actually understand, like the context is actually we want something that's more toxic because that's more
Yeah.
effective against cancers in some cases.
So that's where I think that the team dynamic, so there's stakeholders, which I think there, we need to have a conversation around how to have stakeholders influence that, but from an actual team development standpoint, we're starting to have a lot of people who've been trained in cancer biology and AI. This is my original training, or synthetic biology and AI, or industrial chemical production and AI, or a whole bunch of different combinations. And having a team where you have kind of multiple pairwise, but non-overlapping entirely perspectives. So yeah, like the toxicity example is a great one where you actually want selective and targeted toxicity for your chemotherapy, rather than say, all right, well, we were going to create chemical weapons. And you're like, well, a chemotherapy is literally a chemical weapon just against a biology we have decided is relative to do that to. So I think you need these perspectives. You need a clinician who understands AI, because a lot of these conversations is AI people who never worked in biology. So they don't understand what's actually possible with the things that are sequence generated, or biology people who don't really understand the limitations of AI just by training. And so that's the pairing of I think there's kind of a minimum N of 3. That would be a really quality set of skill sets, but I think that's relative. What those skill sets are relative to the problem you're trying to tackle.
So the notion is we could actually presumably encode those norms of that group earlier on, so that it sort of, to your point, understands, like, I don't want to go in that space.
Right.
Okay.
And I'm of the mindset that we're not going to have one model to rule them all. And so you could say, all right, I want a model that is we're thinking of toxicity in context. So chemotherapy, yes. Nerve agents, no. How do we understand the difference in that from a chemical standpoint, and how we encode that?
But this teaming, I'm still thinking like you're still, who's going to be defining, so this team is going to have this experts from AI. What about the patients who there's some limit to how much toxicity they can tolerate on their body, and they're not willing to sacrifice, willing to pay that price or something. Like, how are you going to incorporate their perspectives in there as well?
Yeah, so in that context, right now I'm talking in this example with the drug development process, you're a long way from drug development and patients being applied in some capacity. But I think if you think about the violet teaming in a different context of where the patient's involved, you understand from a patient's medical history, because there's a lot of EHR, electronic health record AI going on as well, how their past response with toxicity and the set of available pharmaceuticals might play together. And so I think that's another a separate context that needs to have clinicians, patients involved in that community of practice, as Adam called it. But I think that it's not a do it once and we solve it all. It's a figure out the process and the techniques. And I think this is going to be iterative across the board, because we're not going to do it right the first time or perfectly the first time. And who knows, clinical standards and toxicity thresholds might change. And so you actually have to think about how to evolve our drug development process over time, as maybe we collectively are less amenable to toxicity. So we have lower toxicity thresholds than we do today in drug development.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in social science, we have this perception that, you collect your data, you analyze your result, you get your conclusion. But actually in really big team science, there are very different dynamics depending on what stage that supply chain you're at. To include hypothesis generation to actually implementation, right? And they require very different kinds of collaboration mechanisms. It's not something like what you're saying is at one part of the supply chain of developing these pharmaceuticals or drugs, there'll be one approach to that team, but at the larger, when you start getting closer to the patient, it'll be a different kind of
right. Well, in patients, so people are starting to do AI for clinical trial design. And so maybe if you take the patient context into account, someone who is more resilient to potential toxicity, but has a disease that is more pressing, gets placed in a clinical trial where otherwise people would say that's probably too toxic of a drug, but it is the drug that makes sense given that context. And I don't know the answer to how to build that, but that's another setting in the kind of, at least pharmaceutical value chain.
So basically, to kind of leverage full value out of these ASs, we all have to sacrifice, basically, what sacrifice do we need to make? We need to like give up all of our data, we need to give up all our expectations of privacy so that, you know, all that enough data is available to make all these decisions.
So most people who are in clinical trial systems, all that data is there.
Yeah, they make that choice, right?
So it's not that your data is just out there. I mean, healthcare systems are starting to do this, where within the healthcare system.
Healthcare, and right now I'm reading papers, for example, like oh, we can diagnose depression just from your social media posts. Well, I don't want to reveal that much data. I don't want somebody to like market me drugs that they think will help me. If I, it's like, this is like, we're really getting into this. AI is really powerful, but how much are we willing to sacrifice to get to leverage its
ethical
power?
and societal context is key in all of these discussions.
I see the big challenge with violet teaming is sort of analogous to the self-driving car problem, which is that, as long as it keeps everyone safe, everyone's happy. And the moment someone dies, then they're going to point at it and say, well, this system was flawed.
Right.
Don't you have the same problem here with violet teaming, which is it could do all these great things, but the moment that it fails to prevent something really bad happening, then it's going to be.
Yes, I think that from a societal context standpoint, there's going to be backlash right now like that. Right now, no one's even doing any of it. Like people are saying, I don't want to have bad things happen, but there's no balance. And so, yeah, that does become a bit of a science risk of but this kind of dual use conversation around technology in general, that comes in all of those contexts. And yeah, I was having a conversation with a program manager at a funding agency who said, I want to run a program that uses AI, but I don't want someone to accuse me of the AI that we build to be misused like that. So at least we could say we're investing in trying to build the techniques and methods to prevent that while still being able to use it for the programs that we're trying to run. So it's not an easy, the risks conversation is not an easy one. And there's always going to be people who say, see, we told you. But right now, the conversation is the ether said this is scary, so we need to stop it from being scary. And there's not a lot of context to temper how far that goes.
Can I draw one distinction, which is interesting because it's a good analogy. That concern doesn't seem to have impacted the billions of dollars being invested in autonomy and self-driving cars.
No.
In fact, it's sort of innovated. I don't see the billions of dollars being poured into violet teaming yet to address this. Why not? Why isn't this being done already? And you've already specified a couple of hypotheses. People don't think about it. We don't have the skill sets. But what's going to be the tipping point where this takes off and people realize, oh yeah, we need to pour as much money on this as we do?
I think that these areas I think this is all so new. And I think people know in the context that people have been thinking about AI for a long time, which is in imaging and audio and things like that. People have always said, all right, we need to make sure we try to have some kind of security paradigm here. Always might be a strong word, but it's definitely more of a consideration now. I think it's just a level of maturity and a perspective of a lot of these things intersecting. I think a lot of the people doing AI in biology, for example, are really focused on drug development. They're not focused on security. I think the people in AGI and AI security and AI ethics think about it in the human experience context, but not necessarily in the biology or infrastructure management context. And so I do think it's a part of it is just timing of there's not enough people to do all the problems that we want to be tackling. And I think another one is it's hard. And so a lot of people say, we haven't even figured out the genotype-to-phenotype relationship in general. How are we going to then use it to manage AI risk? It's not an easy question. And I think there are easier questions to answer in many fields right now.
Are there online questions?
Nothing in the chat, but it's 12:02. So I think we should thank our speaker.
Perfect.
Can I also take the opportunity to thank our support team who responded really well to the Zoom disaster, by the way. Thank you very much, guys. But also over to Titus.